and welcome to our second session of the day, How to Make Your Application Accessible and Keep It That Way by Joel Hawksley. Joel is a staff software engineer at GitHub working on user interface architecture and strategy. Please welcome Joel to the stage.
Thank you. All right. So one of the things I love most about coming to RailsConf every year is how lovely this community is. You know, I feel like everyone is so welcoming and caring, and it's something that I think is a bit of a hallmark of the Ruby community. I don't know about you guys, but I think that, you know, as programmers, we're often stereotyped. I certainly feel like I am by my friends and family about, you know, that we're kind of an out-of-touch group, but I think that it's really cool how the Ruby community has come to identify itself with inclusivity. But on that note, I have some really bad news, and that's that as an industry, the things we build are often incredibly unwelcoming to the people we build them for, especially to people with disabilities. So depending on who you ask, between 70 and 99% of the internet is effectively unusable to people who are blind. But I have some good news. We can do better. And I'm here to show you how we are doing better at GitHub. So while we've been working hard over the last couple of years to make GitHub more usable for people with disabilities, we've learned a lot along the way. And I'd like to share what's gone well and what hasn't gone well for us so that you can do just the good stuff at your company and not spin your wheels like we have. So I might as well do a quick intro here. My name is Joel. I'm a staff engineer. I guess I got this intro already. I work on kind of UI company wide related initiatives. Some people call my position like a UI architect. Lately, that has been accessibility. This is my 6th time speaking at RailsConf. I'm hoping to speak at the last one next year. And it's so great to be here in Detroit with all of you. So my talk is actually kind of a continuation of a talk I gave last year, and I'm going to provide a brief summary to provide some context. So last year I shared how we use Axe, which is an automated accessibility scanner. How many people here have heard of Axe? That's great. So I can kind of assume some knowledge of Axe. I showed how we use it to automatically surface accessibility issues in our application. So we use it when you're a developer working on GitHub, you'll see red outlines around elements with Axe errors. I also shared how we use custom Rails form builders to eliminate certain classes of accessibility errors. And then I also shared how we use a tool called Lookbook, which you can think of as basically Storybook, but in a Rails first architecture. And we use that with its built-in accessibility tools to surface accessibility errors in the UI development process. And I thought this talk was pretty good. People seemed to like it, but we had a great Q&A afterwards, and I realized from the Q&A that I gave the wrong talk. So this year I'm giving the talk I should have given last year based on that Q&A. And the questions really amounted to what we all hear as Rails developers, which is, that's nice, but will it scale? More specifically, the questions were, how do you get leadership to care about accessibility? How do you make not just one page, but your entire application, maybe one as big as GitHub's, accessible? And then how do you keep it that way? So before I get too far, how many of you here work at companies that have an accessibility goal of some kind? Wow, about half. I think that last year that number was a lot lower. How many of you here have worked on your company's accessibility goals? Pretty good, about a quarter. Yeah. You know, we've long worked to make GitHub accessible in various capacities. You know, over the years we had a couple different UI teams that did it in some way or another, but it was always in fits and starts. It was never like a whole company-wide approach. It was never really coordinated across teams, and we never really had any specific goals, like a specific target we wanted to reach, until 2018, when we were bought by Microsoft. I know that when this happened, there was a lot of skepticism about the impact the purchase of GitHub was going to have, and while it has had its ups and downs, one of the major impacts was around accessibility, because Microsoft really cares about it. As many of you know, Microsoft disproportionately sells its software to large corporations, large governments, and those entities really care about accessibility. There are, of course, a ton of non-technical and non-economic reasons to make our products accessible. I think that as a very inclusive community, we kind of have a shared belief that it's just kind of the right thing to do. But today, I'm going to focus on the pragmatic and, in some cases, capitalistic reasons that we make our applications accessible, because I don't think that we need to convince anyone about the emotional or moral. So one of the big things is that accessibility is a legal risk. I am not a lawyer, but I work with lawyers at GitHub who are very happy that we're here talking about accessibility. And it wouldn't be this kind of presentation without mentioning that accessibility is a legal risk, and it can be a significant one. Many companies have faced legal pressure for accessibility issues, and GitHub is one of them. And the thing is, legal pressure has long been a tool in the accessibility industry, not just for digital accessibility. This is a bit of an extreme example, but for decades, wheelchair users have found that lawsuits are the best ways to actually make the world accessible for them, whether that's suing, a restaurant for not having a ramp or a table that they can use. That has proven, for better or for worse, at least in America, of being the best way to actually make the world accessible for people with disabilities. And the same is proving true for web apps, unfortunately. According to Forbes, who first and foremost doesn't know the meaning of the word exponential, there were over twice as many digital accessibility lawsuits over a 5-year period between 2018 and 2023. And this is wild to me. In that same period, or it was actually the last trailing 5 years, 80% of the top 500 e-commerce websites received a digital accessibility lawsuit. It's basically all of them. So our most concrete goal for GitHub is to make our user experience work for people who use assistive technology. And in practice, that means complying with WCAG, which is one of the most common standards, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And this is what is used by governments and large corporations to basically have an agreed upon standard when talking about digital accessibility. So whenever I share any stories about working at GitHub, I think it's always important to provide a moment in time snapshot of what our company looks like, because we all work at companies of various sizes, and I don't want you to think that what we're doing is what's right for your company. So we have over 4,000 employees. Over 1,500 of them are engineers. And I'm very happy to say, and I say this every year, we are still a Ruby on Rails monolith. It's very big. We have a few dozen supporting services. But when you go to github.com and when you make an API request, nearly all of those requests are going directly into Rails. Somewhat unique to our application is we have over 2,000 unique pages. This is literally like you go to a URL and it looks like something. We have 2,000 of those, which I've heard from talking to other people in the industry is very different than other companies of our size. Like Shopify, I know, for example, their public-facing surface area is maybe even almost an order of magnitude smaller, at least for their kind of equivalent measurement. Also, only about 95% of our UI is still rendered in ERB, although we're starting to migrate some stuff to React. That's about 5% of the company. So to get an idea of everyone in the audience today, how many? Let's start by all raising our hands. Is your company at least one engineer? Okay, is it at least 10? 100? 1,000? Okay, so where do you guys work? Shopify? Where at? Chime? GitHub. And GitHub, there you go. Yeah. Does anyone work at a company with 10,000 engineers or more? I feel like we had someone at one point. That would be crazy. Regardless of the size, I'm hoping that what I can share today will be useful at your company. And I kind of boil it down to 3 things. One is measurement. The second one is durable ownership. And the last one is lived experience. So a few years ago, when I switched teams at GitHub, I actually joined the design organization as an engineer. And I reported to my colleague Diana, who eventually became our head of design. And I remember one time Like a lot of engineers, I stepped into a code base that I hadn't been in before, and I thought everything was wrong and that it needed to change. And specifically, I was really frustrated by the amount of technical debt we had around an older system, an older version of our design system that we weren't really using anymore, but was still used all across the product. And I remember something she said, which was that there will always be something to refactor in these large legacy code bases. Why should we care about this one this time? And how will I know when you're done? And one of the things that led me to is reading this book called How to Measure Anything, which is really dry. I wouldn't read it. But basically what it argues is that the value of a measurement is helping you decide whether you met your goal or not. And you really don't need to be any more precise than that. And I think that one great example of that is our tests. Our tests are binary measurements, and they literally just tell us whether we've succeeded or failed. That is still a measurement. Said another way, if premature optimization is the root of all evil, trying to change something without a target or without optimization, an optimization target, is the root of all evil. So when we were starting to look at accessibility at a company-wide scale, we really needed to measure the problem. And the way we did it is we started with our DNS. So like everything in GitHub, we tried to find clever ways to put it under source control. So I was actually able to look at our DNS repo that has all of our DNS configuration in it. And this gave me a list of about the 100 domains that we have that are public facing. And I just started by writing a script that ran Axe on all of them. So this is a Axe report in Datadog that shows that we had about 18 Axe violations for the root page that you would load when you loaded a domain name that we controlled. What's great is that, going back to some of the data I shared earlier, the industry averages 55 Axe violations for a homepage that's for the top 1 million websites by traffic. So we were doing pretty well. We're already, about around a third of the industry average. But even one of these Axe violations can mean that your page is very difficult to use for someone with assistive technology. So we use the same tooling to scan our design system documentation. And in this case, this shows our primary view components library. When I made this graph, someone was like, oh, there's only 50. We should do that for a month. So we did a bug bash and got it down to effectively 0. We also use it in system tests. So we have a set of system tests that run across maybe about a dozen key scenarios in github.com. And for that same set of tests, this shows the impact of doing kind of a quarter-long effort to reduce our Axe violations. We also track really long-term trends for some of our most critical rules. This is some work my colleague Kate Higa did recently. And what we did is, because our linting rules actually weren't in effect all the way back 4 years, this is a period of 2020 to the present, she wrote them separately and then checked out a commit every month for the last 4 years and retrospectively scanned our code base for Axe violations for all of those monthly increments to show, if we had that linter in place, how bad things would have been. So a lot of people think that when they're doing statistics work that you have to it's only forward looking, that you can't measure something in the past that already happened, but thanks to Git, you actually can. So if you want to start to look at creating data around your accessibility problem, know that you can look into the past and you can run your scans that way. So I think that data is really helpful because what it shows is that, we are using those Axe tools to make a page accessible, or at least not as inaccessible. And what's great as well is that by showing those trends, we can say, okay, leadership, when you gave us 3 engineers for a quarter, we actually had this meaningful impact on the accessibility of our application. We didn't just close 10 PRs, we actually meaningfully reduced, say, the image alt text violations that we had. So to sum it up, you can't improve what you can't measure. Even a measurement that is a proxy for accessibility, such as Axe scanning, can be useful to demonstrate the value of this kind of work to non-technical people. And I'd encourage you to at least measure your Axe violations in your application, and then set aside some time to resolve them. And you can imagine that might be a good way to start the conversation about how much your company wants to accept the risk of, say, digital accessibility lawsuits. So say you've done all that, you've measured the scale of your problem, and let's say you've gotten your app X clean. We're pretty far down that path at this point. How do you keep it that way? This question reminds me of one of my favorite thought experiments, which is the ship of Theseus. Does anyone know what the ship of Theseus is? Okay, I'll take someone's explanation. Do you want to explain it?
The idea that if you have a ship and you replace it plank by plank, you still have the same ship after every plank has been replaced.
Exactly. So I think it's an excellent metaphor for legacy software, because I think every piece of legacy software is a ship of Theseus, and that, you know, our code gets moved around, people rotate to different teams, they go on paternity leave like I did, you know, people go on to other jobs. So how do you make sure that, like, when all those things happen, that responsibility doesn't fall through the cracks? And this is kind of starting to trend into like big company problem territory. But we use a tool called a service catalog. And we initially use this to track availability and security across our systems. And basically what it means is that, like, we split up GitHub, often by URL, into core disciplines. So for example, we have like a pull request discipline, repositories discipline, etc. And for every single slice of the application, we have a PagerDuty rotation, and we have a vice president who is responsible for that. And what's really great is that we just do that all through code owners. So we literally say, okay, that test file in this case, like, goes to the, you know, the feeds team. And we also will do some programmatic mapping. So say, for example, we have a controller, we have a map to service macro that will map, say, the compare controller. This is when you're doing a comparison for a pull request that goes to the repos team in this case. The really important thing, though, from a ship of Theseus standpoint, is that every line of code ends up being owned by a service, not a person. So a lot of the way people use code owners, if we go back, is that you'd have a person's name here, is what I often see when people use GitHub the product. What I would say is the better habit is to use a team. And what's really great about that is that, you know, over about a period of about 2 years, we went through and made sure that every single file in GitHub had a team that owned it, that was staffed, and had an on-call rotation. And it was pretty eye-opening really quickly. Like, it made us realize that, like, there were bus factors everywhere. Like, there was a single person, you know, you've seen the cartoon of like the single block holding up the Jenga tower that is the whole open source ecosystem. Well, that was actually, some portions of our product were that way, including some critical infrastructure. It also made us realize that we were, like, missing playbooks for on-call rotation. So say that code was well owned and had an on-call rotation, there was no actual documentation, say if that team, you know, had 2 new people join. I would say that in terms of things GitHub has done as we've scaled, especially since being acquired by Microsoft, this is one of the key disciplines that some of the people at Microsoft with a lot more experience brought to the company. And I can also say that it's not just an organizational thing. There's some really cool technical stuff you can do. And I could have done a better job cropping this, but this is a Sentry exception. And you can notice there, the thing that I've highlighted is that it's automatically assigned to a catalog service because we know who owns the file where the exception was, which means we can automatically assign that error to an on-call rotation and know exactly who to page. So basically, when we care about something in engineering, we create a scorecard for it, such as availability, and then we incrementally add services to that scorecard and make sure that they're compliant with it. For those of you who have done SOC 2, has anyone here done SOC 2? Oh, that's so great that it's only one of you. God bless. Oh, man. Yeah, when you get bigger, you start to have to do more compliance stuff to basically show that you have your act together on certain things, and this is a very common pattern for SOC 2 security compliance. So when you have a scorecard like this, basically, it comes down to whether you're passing or failing it. And if you're failing it, that's a thing that alerts, say, like your VP to, like, come in and help you and make sure that you get the resources you need. So what does this have to do with accessibility? Well, accessibility is one of those top priorities for us, right alongside availability and security. In fact, when we talk about accessibility, we often jokingly say that whenever you're talking about security or availability, take that same sentence and put accessibility in their place, and it's probably still true. So for example, we have a scorecard that enforces that our accessibility linters are being used. And this is kind of our high level view that we can see that, okay, of the 81 services we think should be reporting their disabled lint rules to Datadog, 70 of them are doing that. And that gives us a task to say, okay, we need to go in and make sure that those other 10 services go in and set up their linting correctly. And then we track that participation over time. So this Datadog graph shows the total scope of our accessibility program. So in this case, we actually have 220 services, which roughly maps to teams that need to do work for our accessibility program over a multi-year timeline. And the bottom number that's growing is the number of teams we've engaged with currently. So we're starting with like the most critical parts of the application, and that number is, hovering in it's like 65 or something like that at this point. So that's durable ownership. As you've seen, code teams and projects, they can all rotate, they can come and go. We should be finding ways to make sure that when that happens, things don't become unowned. And depending on the scale of your company, a service catalog might not be the best way to do it, but making sure that you don't have a single point of failure, that it's very clear who owns what, is often a really important step to doing these kinds of programs more unilaterally than just like a page here or there. But at the end of the day, as Hillary's talk before mine really explained well, the goal of accessibility work is ultimately to make our products useful for people with disabilities. It's not to pass any specific audit. Like, yes, we're talking about WCAG, and yes, we audit to WCAG, but that's kind of the model of reality, not what we're really ultimately aiming for. While we can get really far with some of the automation and tooling stuff I've shared today, there really is no substitute for lived experience. So as a starting point, what we did is we started teaching sighted developers across GitHub how to use screen readers to test their work. We also set up a champions program, which is basically a model where you train someone on each team to be an expert in a specific topic. So in this case, we've trained about 60 people on 60 different product teams with call it 20 hours of accessibility training to help them understand how to use screen readers. Our goal is basically to have one of those champions on as many of our teams that build UI at the company as possible. And to measure their impact, we started tracking how many issues they closed. So as we train these champions, what we do is we start assigning them accessibility issues that come up. And you can see that over time, we are actually having, I think this is monthly tallies, the number of accessibility issues being closed by these people we've trained. That's allowing us to scale the impact of our program without making our central team 50 engineers. Of course, the real elephant in the room is that we don't really employ many people with specifically that have sighted disabilities. They are a very, very small minority of the company. So to help fill that gap, we've actually hired a couple different consultancies who specialized in this. And I can tell you that this has probably been the most startling part of this process. Has anyone here watched something they've built be used by someone who's blind? I cried the first time it happened, seriously. It was maybe one of the lower points in my career was watching someone who obviously struggles in their day-to-day interaction with technology have one of those terrible interactions be something that I'm responsible for. If there's nothing else you take away from today, you need to have someone who is blind using your software and directly showing you their experience. Forget all the automation. You have to do that. The problem is that good consultants aren't cheap. In fact, we pay our accessibility consultants way more than we pay our Rails consultants, for example. If you can't afford that, a good starting point, something that we still do in addition to all this work is, we have hackathons where people just use screen readers. We have, a passion weeks where people learn about screen reader technology and test a specific thing they are working on. And on the product side, we use this pile of acronyms. One of them, basically what we do is we produce what are called ACRs, which are Accessibility Conformance Reports, which use a VPAT, which is a specific template that's an industry standard. And that is used to report on our compliance with Section 508. And really what that means is that we start by looking at our product once we know how to use screen readers and basically just documenting the problems we found. It's not even solving them. It's just saying, here are the problems that we know about. And we publish ours publicly. You can go see this today. If you go to accessibility.github.com, you'll see a bunch of core scenarios, including one that looks like this. And this shows, amongst other things, some issues we have on our homepage. And the reason this is important is that even if you don't solve change the accessibility of your application at all, a lot of companies now won't buy your product unless they know how inaccessible it is. Like they'll just care, like, okay, have these people even thought about it? So this is step one. We actually use a letter grading system. So we call this a D. So you get a D on your accessibility report if you go in and basically document your known problems. Just to give you an idea of the context, we do about a dozen of these for our critical workflows, and we do that, with standard assistive technology like NVDA. We also do this every year. A lot of customers expect these to be up to date. This isn't something you can do once. We do it at a minimum of once a year for the entire product, all 2,000 pages. And we do it more often for more critical paths. Like if something is changing more often, you could imagine in some of your applications, there's some UI that probably changes drastically over the course of a year. You should probably audit that more often than yearly. So for those manual audits where we're looking at things specifically, we also put those on a scorecard. As you can see, we are a little bit more behind on our numbers for that. And then of course, we track our progress over time. I'm not really allowed to show like a very long time horizon for that, but just know that we put those on a graph too. So while this is like ultimately kind of the dry compliance part, I think that this concept of an ACR, accessibility conformance report, is actually really compelling if you think about it, because what it does is it forces us to identify the key experiences in our application and then see if those key things are usable by customers with disabilities. And what I love about this is that I actually think it's a perfect way to bridge that like technical management divide, because it's easy to make the case to say, leadership at your company that like someone who's blind should be able to give you money, right? Like that's often like a key user scenario is I can sign in and swipe my credit card, basically. The last thing we want to have happen is to find out, as is often the case in accessibility lawsuits, that someone literally just can't do business with you. That's often what they boil down to. And we have to make the case because, as I've mentioned, this is a very expensive work. For a rough ballpark, we're in the mid millions, like single digit millions, in terms of cost per year for our accessibility work. I think we have 8 accessibility engineers that are full-time, 3 designers, an EM for both of those teams, and then anywhere around 10 to 12 consultants working with us at any given time. Now, I recognize this is a lot to ask. This is a big hill to climb, especially for smaller companies. But I'm going to give you guys a head start for what I think you should do today if you don't have accessibility work going on at your company. And it's going to be 3 user stories. So the first user story is, as a screen reader user, I can sign in and create an account. Believe it or not, we failed this one because of CAPTCHAs when we first looked into this. This is often where you will fail this one. So set up VoiceOver on your computer and go to town, see if you can make an account. Second thing, as I said, is as a screen reader user, I can upgrade to a paid account. A lot of people end up using third-party payment flows, whether it's just like a Stripe, embedded iframe, or maybe you bump out to a third-party, checkout flow or something like that. That whole interaction can be inaccessible as well. And then the third thing is, as a screen reader user, I can complete the workflow for my product's most compelling use case. So if you think about, from a product management standpoint, this might be, what is your company's MVP? Like when the founder of your company was first trying to prove to someone that this company was worth it, what were they proving? You should have a screen reader test for that key value proposition. And it's pretty easy to go to a C-suite person and be like, hey, we need to prove that like the fundamental reason you started this company works for people who are blind. For GitHub, you can imagine what that might look like. We have actually a couple of these. One is like, I can open a PR. Another one is I can merge a PR and like go through the code review process. Another one is I can use GitHub Actions to review checks. But here's how you're going to do it. I'm going to show you how to do this with TDD. So one key technique we've adopted through all of this learning is that you can use system tests to do keyboard-only navigation, and that if you combine that with Axe, you actually get about 95% of the way there that you get with all the expensive auditing that you do. And we do this by taking our existing system tests and taking places that we clicked on things and turning them into keyboard interactions. So, for example, we write our system tests in JavaScript. I know. This is the test that creates a new release from a git tag using the keyboard. There's really nothing too exciting here. Probably didn't even need to show the code, but you go to the releases new page, you look up the button that says choose a tag, you tab to it and press enter, and then you wait for the find or new create tag input to come up, you fill it out, and then you go and create the tag. What's wild here, this is the first time we did this conversion. And my colleague Kate Higa converted the test, and this found a bug. And this is wild to me. I remember her working on this for like 2 days before she realized that if there isn't a cursor in the window, the JavaScript that loads that spinner never fires. But like, how often are you working in an environment where there's no cursor, literally just not present? So it was a mouse event, because we do a lot of like optimistic loading and whatnot based on user interactions. It was a mouse event that actually triggered this load, and apparently on iOS there was like enough of touch events happening that it would trigger it as well. But she was going on and on and on. She's like, why is this failing? I cannot reproduce it in a browser. And then finally she was like, oh, I'll just send it to someone who uses a screen reader. And they were like, oh yeah, doesn't work. Immediately. And I think that like when you think about TDD in this space, like that's like kind of to me the biggest fear with accessibility work is that because I don't use a screen reader every day, I have no clue what I'm missing. So what we found is that just writing keyboard-only tests where you're only allowed to use the keyboard actually surfaces these problems pretty reliably. So you don't necessarily need to be using screen reader technology day in and day out to catch these kinds of problems. And you can imagine where that might go then, which is like, well, if your automated tests are succeeding in catching these errors just by only using the keyboard, maybe we should stop using our mice all the time. So some people on our team practice no mouse Fridays. They're also Vim users. I think that might be something to do with it. They're just rubbing it in. But that can be a really effective way, I would say, to get a lot of bang for your buck. Just don't use your mouse all the time. You'll find a lot of these issues, and you don't need to use the assistive technology to get there. And like I said, I think this is kind of a cool shortcut. Like, I would say that 95% of our problems would have been caught just by using Axe and not using a mouse. But ultimately, for lived experience to matter, we need to employ people who have these disabilities. And then we need to give them power to change our products. And in our case, we ended up hiring a fantastic lead of our accessibility program. He has decades of experience, and he leads our efforts from the legal department. He also happens to be a screen reader user. His name is Ed. If you look up Ed Summers' work online, you can see him all over the place talking about the work we do. And I think that ultimately it was putting someone who was blind in a position of power that really changed the course of our work. I personally think in my 6 years at the company that is the best decision our leadership has ever made, was giving him money, basically. So I think it'd be disingenuous not to mention that this work is really hard. As I've said, it's expensive, it's time consuming, and I can guarantee you it's going to slow you down. But beyond being the right thing to do, our customers increasingly require it. selling to the government and to big business often means more compliance burdens like this, and it can limit how quickly your company can innovate. But if we don't pursue this work, we really run the risk of leaving those people with disabilities even further behind in an increasingly technological world. So here's my challenge for all of you. Go out, measure your product's accessibility, and communicate it with the people who matter. Then own up to it, own the problem, and then give people with lived experience the power to make it better. Thank you. I want to thank my peer reviewers who are listed there. Kendall, Eric, Kate, Lindsay, Tim, and Jonathan, who all reviewed the talk for me. And I have, this is great. I have 6 minutes for questions. Or seeds for next year's talk. Yeah. Oh, that's a great talk for next year. The question is what does pushback look like from, and whether I've gotten more from up the chain in leadership or down the chain in like the teams that are doing this work? I'd say it's been both. Like I kind of mentioned, for down the chain, people are under a lot of pressure to comply with a lot of things. Like I mentioned, we have other priorities around availability and security. Well, there are also people from those teams knocking on every team's door, trying to get them to be a champion for security and availability. I think that's like the thing that we are constantly working on is figuring out like the smallest amount of time we can ask of someone that will be valuable. And in fact, to be honest with you, one of the things we've done is we haven't used champions for everything, because we found that like we could spend, 10 hours of someone's time training them and getting them to solve an issue, or we could spend half an hour of an expert's time. And you have to like measure that trade-off and say, okay, is it worth teaching that person to solve that one thing, or do we just have an expert solve it on a centralized team? And yes, we've also gotten pushback from leadership, because leadership has said, okay, what's the minimum amount of work we can do not to get sued, quite frankly. That's where standards matter, because, and that's why I say that like having a measurement and a target is like the most important thing you can do, because if you can agree on what matters between management and engineering, you're going to be able to succeed. What often happens is that you have different visions for what is good enough, and then when those things differ, that's where the friction comes from. Yeah.
Thank you. What are the differences between a web app and a mobile app, especially with regard to how you do these things that you're talking about, aside from like the more people social aspects?
Sure. So you still need people to manually use the app. The automated testing story is different. There are tools from DQ who makes apps specifically for mobile applications. I find that in practice, we are leaning more on manual testing. Trying to think what other differences are interesting. I will say that generally what we've observed is that for the disability community, there is a disproportionate reliance on apps. So you will likely find more scrutiny of your mobile app by users of assistive technology than you will of your web application. That's just our experience. I don't know if that's universally true. Yeah.
A lot of the like reports and acts specifically, they all kind of report after you've written the code. Have you found any success in like just getting developers to write more accessible code by default? Or tooling, or just anything in that realm where it's like, oh, if we could just use this tool, it would be more accessible by default instead of trying to report after the fact.
It was actually the title of my talk last year.
Oh, okay.
It was
okay.
accessible by default.
Okay, cool.
And it talks about like the tooling specific things. I would say that like the problem with tooling that we found is what some people call integration hell, which is that you can build accessible things, but when you combine those things together, the combination can be inaccessible, which is why accessibility to me is ultimately an integration concern. Yes, you want to have accessible fundamentals, but it's not enough. So I think that the answer is that you really need both. You need to have, like I'm in what we call the core UX organization of the company, which is all our UI tooling. I do architecture stuff around our design system a lot. And that is one of our main answers is like, okay, build it with a design system. We've generally looked at most of the system for accessibility stuff. And we can say like, okay, if you combine all these components together, we at least know all the individual pieces are accessible. The problem is that you're still combining them. And they might not make, those combinations might not make sense technically. They also might not make sense semantically. So it's both is the answer. Yeah.
I'm curious if you have any experience generating buy-in from like day-to-day developers. Like we have an Axe like code block and it's kind of annoying, and I don't know. It's like I put my test somewhere else sometimes, and it's like it's hard to see the impact, I guess, I feel, as a day-to-day developer.
Well, so I think the champions work has been a good way to get people in their day-to-day to think about it, to be, if they're using like a screen reader or something like that, that's a way for them to empathize with it. I'm trying to think what the other things are that we do. I mean, to be quite honest with you, that is hard. Like, I recognize that like I'm one of many people knocking on every team's door saying like, hey, you know, it would be great if you could do this. I think the main thing is that we think about that as a product. So like we have a product manager who literally like that relationship is their product. And you have to think about it that way and it's a really good question because we're actually completely rethinking our program now because we have done all this work prioritizing like our most trafficked pages. We call them the strategic pages. And they are, you know, the top 100 pages on GitHub get like 90% of the traffic or something like that. So we're like, okay, we got to do a real good job there. But what about those other 1,900 pages? Does it still make sense for us to knock on the door of every single one of those teams, or should we like really lean into automation or standardization, those kinds of things? So another way to answer a question is think about the role that a central team could play, or a central person, in just going in and making targeted fixes as an expert, because that's an important tool that I think that we actually underplayed and are starting to play a little bit more, because it just doesn't make sense to go to, you know, the remaining 1,900 pages and do all the stuff we did. There's just too much overhead. Yeah, so maybe it isn't an Axe test. Maybe you just have someone who goes in through the app and just does it themselves. I'm out of time. That's what the red light means. This is so helpful. But I'll be around for questions. Happy to grab lunch, whatever. Thank you all.